Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. No mai, haere mai, ki o tako whakaihu waka. It is wonderful to see you all for this sixth de Carle Distinguished Lecture, sixth and final. As always, I will begin with health and safety. We have toilets to my right, your left, through the brown double doors, and also a smaller set of toilets through your immediate brown doors on my right. If there is an emergency, we will exit through the doors on my left and your right behind you. We will cross the museum reserve and gather at the bus stop. Before I hand over to our distinguished guests today, I do want to just say a few words of thanks. I want to thank the Hutton Theater for giving us such a wonderful, warm, an effective welcome, a place for us to convivially think about some really difficult ideas. It was wonderful doing that here. Thank you, Hutton Theater staff. I want to thank the units that have supported us. Hekopapa Hananga, Otago's Climate Change Research Network has been wonderful for us. The politics program, the sociology program, the philosophy program, the entire Division of Humanities and the de Carle Endowment itself have all been just wonderful supporters for us. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you. It's wonderful to see these familiar faces, to know that we have been learning these really sort of head-stretching, super important things together. And I'm just very grateful that you've hung on for this wonderful event for all of us together. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Hugh Campbell, who is going to be saying a few words of welcome on behalf of the Division of Humanities. Hugh is the Pro-Vice Chancellor Humanities for the University of Otago and a professor of sociology and just a colleague who I love to talk to. I'm going to hand the podium over to Hugh.
Thank you, Lisa. E te atua tēnā koe, te papatua nuku tēnā koe, e te whareo Tuhura, the Otago Museum, e tu nei, te mana whenua o tēnā rohi, tēnā koutou, ngā iwi o ngā haua whā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Hugh Campbell, toka wingoa, ko a te manakura o te kete ara nui. So I'm Hugh Campbell, I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Division of Humanities at the University of Otago, Otako Whakawiku Waka. Welcome along tonight to this, what is being celebrated as a remarkable set of lectures. It's a great honour to be able to deliver the introduction to this final lecture. The de Carle lectures are they're really a cherished part of our scholarly life at the university. They provide a unique opportunity to do exactly the kinds of things that a humanities division and humanities scholarship really ought to be doing. That's applying the best scholarly insights from the humanities to compelling societal and planetary issues. So it is a great pleasure for me as Pro-Vice Chancellor to be able to stand here and introduce tonight's lecture. The key theme of Professor McKean's lecture series is remarkably well matched with a compelling set of crises that seem to characterise our present moment. Nothing catches our attention, particularly this crowd, like the climate crisis. Yet that crisis is unfolding alongside a more abstract and yet also highly concerning challenge, namely the ascending volume of political and cultural attacks on humanities scholarship in general and the kinds of work we do at universities. In pondering both these crises and why the humanities sits at the centre of our response, I recalled about 15 years ago, just checking who's in the room here at the moment. I recall about 15 years ago, I remember hearing a compelling talk on climate change by one of the doyens of Otago scholarly life, Emeritus Professor Jerry Carrington, who is not here, but I think many people who know Jerry are. Jerry was the driver of the development of energy physics at Otago, and was an early innovator on techniques and systems for technologically moving the world away from a reliance on carbon-based technologies. He is a living legend at the university and a wonderful person. And really, Jerry, no one could speak with more authority than Jerry on the potential for technological solutions to a challenge like the climate crisis. Yet this was his clear message 15 years ago. We already have the tools and systems and technologies to create carbon zero societies now. In that sense, he argued energy physics had completed its main task. It could still refine the engineering techniques and create greater efficiencies, but its job was essentially done. The challenge from here on, Jerry argued, was 99% political and social. And this was talking 15 years ago, when thinking about climate solutions and responses was a little less fervid than it is now. So, having been passed the baton by our most eminent energy physicist in New Zealand, the challenge has come to us in the humanities to try to explain why a world with solutions at its fingertips is simultaneously succeeding and failing to act in a range of complex ways. So I am delighted to have had the privilege of hosting Professor McKean in the Division of Humanities in the University of Otago. His lectures thus far have provided a masterclass in how the humanities can help us understand the climate crisis. He has addressed two of the main modes of understanding why we might actually be hopeful in the face of the climate crisis, and dismissed them both. But the beauty of the Carle lecture series is that he's then had plenty more lectures to pick us up off the floor and articulate why we might actually be able to arrive at a not entirely bleak future. His work is an example of humanities scholarship at its very best and resoundingly answers the compelling challenges of the moment. So I'm delighted to welcome him back to the podium and ask him to deliver this final instalment of the Carle lecture series for 2025. Professor Ben McKean. Oh, you are.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and thanks to the Division of the Humanities and all the other organizations, the programs that Professor Ellis mentioned for hosting me here for all 6 of these lectures. And thanks to all of you who've stuck through so many of them. It is really great to see a community of conversation beginning to be built out of these as people have come to some of them. So this final lecture, I hope will end it's not going to leave despair behind entirely, but it hopefully will provide something like a path to solidarity by reorienting our way of seeing nature. One of the things that's nice about having such a long lecture series is that there's been a lot of stuff that's happened since I started. And so I can work some of that into it. Some of it is about the connection between the climate crisis and the attack on the humanities. So I mentioned in my first lecture Senate Bill 1 in Ohio, which is legislation that would prevent the university from taking a position on climate change and restrict the way controversial, quote unquote, controversial topics can be taught. Unfortunately, I regret to say that that's been signed by the governor and has now become law since then. I also mentioned early on Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, his first act of becoming Prime Minister was eliminating the consumer carbon tax. Since then, he's been re-elected to the surprise of many. And I think that represents perhaps a good starting point for thinking about where the climate movement is. On the one hand, his opponent denied the reality of climate change, wanted to expand fossil fuels, repeal whatever climate legislation Canada had passed. On the other hand, right, here's the success, someone whose first act was to repeal the consumer carbon tax. So as we think about where the climate movement is, I don't think it's any wonder that we're seeing now retrospectives 5-6 years on from climate strikes that happened in 2019. Here's an article from The Guardian from last month. Australia's student strikers for climate believe they could change the future. Where are they now, having not changed the future yet? The article mentions the pandemic, which is of course an important thing to think about in the way it's intervening in all sorts of social movements. But it also mentions 2 other things that are important and that I'm going to come back to. One, it notes that the biggest issue among Gen Z was the cost of living. So that daily pressure of getting by, blocked out the space that people had set aside for addressing climate. It took up that space. And it also cites social media. right, as a way that brought the movement together, but also kept it apart by fracturing audiences and discouraging collective action. Another notable development in the climate movement recently was in the UK, where Just Stop Oil announced that it was ending its current strategy of high-profile direct action. Right? You can see here a BBC article from last month. Just Stop Oil was policed to extinction. Now the movement has gone deeper underground. So Just Stop Oil's model involved small groups of committed activists undertaking targeted actions designed to cause maximum disruption or public outrage. And part of their strategy was to be seen to be punished. That was part of what brought them publicity. But the penalties for protesting became so extreme in the UK that the strategy became unviable, right? You can see here, one of the founders of the group was originally jailed for 5 years for plotting to disrupt traffic, right? That's a cost that very few people are going to be willing to pay, given the benefit that comes from that kind of disruption. Now, it's very unlikely, as this article points out, that the climate activists will stop disrupting things, but they may stop sticking around to get arrested, as the article points out. So as these strategies, which have been designed to appeal for people's attention, have failed, we may see others. Now, as I argued in the second lecture in this series, I don't think it's that surprising that this strategy of spectacular disruption failed. When you have a strategy that's designed to put images in front of people, given the way that people consume images today, it's very easy for those images to have a vivid but brief impact, to be very quickly replaced by another image that we're given as part of the society of the spectacle. I think this is also connected to the problems that the article identifies with the student strikes, which were often brought together by social media, but then also kept apart by it, as connections that had been made online proved hard to maintain once online was all there was, and it was impossible for people to connect in the real world. So if we're taking stock of where the climate movement is, I think it's striking to look at places where, in some respects, things have moved backward, right? Here's an article from taking stock of recent elections in the UK, how the political consensus on climate change has shattered. And I think it's probably an exaggeration to say that there was ever a very strong consensus, but I do think it's notable that you are seeing a fracturing of elite views about climate, that as the climate movement has weakened since 2019, you have elite actors who are trying actively to roll it back. And so as a result, you get headlines like this: climate plan based on phasing out fossil fuels doomed to fail, says Tony Blair. And you have a pollster who says, he hasn't found a significant drop in concern about climate change or support for net zero, even if we're not seeing people on the streets. The fracturing of the consensus has been far more profound at what we'd call elite level than at public level. And so I think that speaks to what's been a long-time strategy of climate activists, which is to convince people at the elite level to do something about it by showing them what it's rational or reasonable to do. And so we can look back now, not just 5 years, but more than 40 years to 1983, to the Ronald Reagan administration in the United States, when Reagan's Environmental Protection Agency released a report, "Can we delay a greenhouse warming?" Right? And it was in 1983, more than 40 years ago, that the EPA called for steps to begin now to deal with expected changes in world temperature and climate. So when we think about how long there's been a climate consensus or what the climate consensus is, right, you have national politics in the United States, global public opinion, understanding perfectly well how climate change worked more than 40 years ago. And yet we've made very, very little progress in addressing this problem, right? Raising awareness isn't enough. So really, to echo the comment made in the introduction about how, in a lot of respects, the scientists have done their job, right? I want to return to this point that I made in an earlier lecture. We've got climate solutions, now we need a movement. Right? The director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication says, we're not lacking climate solutions, we're lacking demand for those solutions. The public and political will isn't yet there to force the system changes that are required. Right, so we've understood the science for more than 40 years. And that knowledge has not produced sufficiently significant policy changes. Right, so the problem isn't our lack of scientific knowledge. The problem is that a real solution requires a major change in our social relations. And the powerful people who benefit from the status quo simply don't want that to happen. Right, so there's no one weird trick to get around that. right? That's just the problem that we have to face. It is in many ways a problem of global democracy, right? And so we've done the science, right? Now we have to do the politics. Oh, that was not what I expected to happen there. There we go. So this is a report I want to from Climate Vanguard called Mapping the Global Youth Climate Movement, where they surveyed 292 youth climate groups around the world to see what was the state of the climate movement. What did the young people involved in climate politics think? And I think it's striking, right? There's two key findings I want to highlight. One is that the youth climate movement is largely united around a radical systemic analysis of the root causes of the climate crisis. Right? The young people overwhelmingly think that the problem is, as they put it, a system that puts profit over people and planet, and they identify that system as capitalism and neocolonialism. Right? That is, in a certain sense, just the common sense of young people involved in climate work. But despite this, the youth climate movement does not currently have a shared and coherent theory of change. So there's the analysis about what the problem is, but there isn't a sense of the solution or the politics of how to address that. So when you look at what are these groups doing, the three most popular activities identified by youth-led climate groups are educational workshops, social media campaigns, and media appearances. And as I think raising awareness has its limits. We already know in a lot of respects what the problem is. Social media campaigns appearing again as an image within the society of the spectacle isn't on its own enough. Right? We need to be involved in other kinds of work. And this isn't just a question for people on the left or people who identify as radical. I want to bring out this quote from the American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey from his 1935 lectures, Liberalism and Social Action. Now, Dewey is writing in the context of the Great Depression. He's trying to think about how to preserve American liberal democracy in the context of rising interest in fascism and communism. And so he takes very seriously the challenge that someone like Lenin poses in asking what is to be done. And Dewey says, the question of what is to be done cannot be ignored. Ideas must be organized, and this organization implies an organization of individuals who hold these ideas and whose faith is ready to translate itself into action. And he engages a little bit of self-reflection. He says it's in organization for action that liberals are weak. And he says the task is to go on, not backward, until the method of intelligence and experimental control is the rule in social relations and social direction. Either we take this road, or we admit that the problem of social organization on behalf of human liberty and the flowering of human capacities is insoluble. Right, so I don't think there's any getting around these problems, no matter what our politics are. And so I asked in an earlier lecture, very much in that spirit, who is the agent of social transformation? How are we going to build a collective agent or agents that are capable of transforming the global economy in a way that's required for actually addressing the climate crisis? If we don't have an account of how people can be organized into this kind of collective agent or agents, right, then our individual actions are not going to be very meaningful. Right? As I suggested before, we could do things like sacrifice, give up a flight to see a sick relative because we think it involves too much carbon emissions. But that kind of a sacrifice might seem meaningless if it's not done with many other people making similar coordinated actions. It might be necessary to do anyway, but it won't have the meaning that we want it to have. And so we need to think through this question about the agent or agents of social transformation. And if we can't, unless we want to give up the idea that we can collectively, rationally, and intentionally change the way that we live together. So I said before that giving an account of the agent of social transformation requires explaining three things. First, who would constitute such an agent and how they would understand themselves, that is, under what name they would collect themselves. And then effectively, what would move people to participate in constituting such an agent. As I've already argued, I don't think hope is necessary there. And also finally, what political and organizational form such an agent would take. And that is not a part that I've addressed in these lectures so far, and it's that piece that I want to take on today, to think through what kind of political and organizational form would be adequate for a collective agent to address the climate crisis. I think it's pretty clear the climate movement as it exists, to the extent we can even call it really a global climate movement, is not adequate to the task at hand. So to do that, to talk through this path to solidarity, first I'm going to explain what is solidarity. Then I'm going to talk about how our current relationship, our exploitative relationship to nature, is an obstacle to solidarity. I'm going to explain a little more about why organizational form is a key component of solidarity. And then I'm going to talk about some of the different scalable organizational forms that we might think are a part of the solution to addressing climate. So that'll include social movements, mass parties, community organizing, revolutionary parties, labor unions. There's, of course, even in a 6-lecture series, there's only so many forms I can cover. But hopefully, I'll be able to look at some of the major contenders that are scalable, and then try and suggest what this tells us about the path to solidarity. So let me start with the significance of solidarity. Right? Solidarity can mean a bunch of different things. Sometimes it's used simply to mean mutual support within some kind of existing or perceived group. Right? So hey, you know, you're also a white guy, let's help each other out, like that kind of thing. It doesn't need to be a bad thing. I mean, it might be for white guys, but you know, for other groups, it's perfectly normal to have solidarity based on shared background, musical taste, any number of things. But that's really, as it were, almost exclusively a kind of identity-based form of solidarity. And the solidarity that I'm interested in is a feeling of unity or connection that's grounded in shared interests. Right? So there's an idea of a kind of common interest that are going to be shared among the group that's in solidarity. Now, what kind of group is going to be appropriate to thinking about climate? Right? Some of the most obvious forms of solidarity are things like civic solidarity, which is solidarity around citizenship in a kind of social democratic welfare state. That's clearly not the right scale for trying to think through this problem. You might also think cosmopolitan solidarity is another form of solidarity people talk about, a kind of solidarity that people have simply in virtue of being humans. Again, I don't think that's the right way to think about solidarity around climate either. That kind of cosmopolitan solidarity is a sort of apolitical solidarity. It, for example, might include even the people who are opponents of climate change. And I think that what we need to be able to do is have a form of solidarity that can identify those people who are obstacles to addressing this problem. So it can't be a solidarity that includes everybody. So what I'm calling for is something that the philosopher Sally Schulz calls political solidarity. And it's solidarity that comes from working together to overcome a shared obstacle to justice or a shared obstacle to enjoying freedom, or even a shared obstacle, in some of these cases, to our sheer survival. Now, it's not automatic that people are going to see their interests as shared. I think that's very clear from something like climate. We can, on the one hand, we can say everyone has an interest in addressing this crisis, but it's clearly idle to do that. It's not an interest being articulated that way that's actually moving people to action. Right? And that's not a surprise. This is often the case with political solidarity because almost everybody in some ways benefits from the status quo and in other ways is harmed by it. Obviously for different groups this is going to come in different proportions, but even badly exploited people may be reluctant to change the system because there are ways in which they benefit from the status quo. Right? They at least are maybe earning some money. Being exploited is better than being completely surplus and not exploited at all. So everybody has something to lose. And so part of the question is, how can you get people to identify with their interest in overcoming this obstacle and transforming the status quo? Right? So part of this is going to turn on how we identify the shared obstacle that we're trying to overcome, and about how we can move people to identify with some of their interests and not with others. And part of this is to say we won't know exactly the boundaries of this kind of political interest group, this solidarity group, until we actually do the politics of trying to engage in this political work. Then we'll find out through those actions who can actually be moved to identify with this interest that I'm saying that we share. So unlike with some of the other forms of solidarity, it isn't pre-given who's going to be in solidarity. We have to find out through practice. Now, how do we orient ourselves to our partners in solidarity? I've introduced some of this in earlier lectures. In my third lecture, I talked about how we can identify the we that I think is going to be able to take action on climate, right? How do we identify that we? Well, I talked about two axes for doing so. One is about the nature of the power of us, right? The power of the people. What kind of power do we say that people have? Is it a form of control that people have? Right? Is it a unitary will that people exercise? Or is the power of the people really a power of negating the status quo and resisting domination? So that's one question. Right? Is it Is it a power of control or a power of resistance? And then also, how do we represent the we? How do we represent the people? Are the people homogenous people? Am I an apt representative of the people because I'm the same as them? Or do I employ a representative logic of difference and say that this is a we that's very different inside, and because of that, some people who are marked as different might be especially apt representatives of the group rather than being outliers? Now, I argued in that lecture that the space that we want to find is a space where, to the extent possible, our identification of this agent won't reproduce the injustices that are bringing us together in the first place, right? So we don't want a we that is going to dominate nature, and we don't want a we that's going to dominate each other. So to do that, I suggest we want to employ the idea of popular power as a form of refusal of domination, which will also help us ensure that the we doesn't come to also dominate nature, to reproduce our domination of nature that exists. And also that it's a representative claim based on difference, to acknowledge the fact that many of us are differently located with respect both to climate change, but also to the fossil fuel economy that is producing climate change. So, for example, through a logic of difference, we might be able to say indigenous groups are especially apt representatives of all of us. They're especially apt leaders of a climate movement because they're marked as different than settler colonial society, because through their experiences they know even better than others the problems with what exists. That's different from a representative logic of homogeneity that says all of us have to be the same in order to be equal. So that's how I've begun to try to answer this question of how to be oriented to partners in solidarity. Now, what's the obstacle to solidarity that we're against? Again, I think I want to look at what the youth climate movement says here. You can see this is from the Climate Vanguard report. A majority of these groups identify a system that puts profit over people and planet as the obstacle. That's how they understand it. And more specifically, right, 80 of those who say that, 89% say that what they mean by that is capitalism and neocolonialism. And I think that's in line with the analysis that I've tried to offer in these lectures. In the second lecture, I talked about how any of us who are interested in the climate crisis are forced to address this temporal double bind, that the tools of politics that we have take time. Political transformation, moving people to action requires building relationships of trust, which cannot happen overnight. Yet we live in a society where we're accustomed to things happening instantaneously with the click of a button, and where we also know very well that the climate crisis is urgent, and we do need to move quickly. And so it can feel like a cause of anxiety or despair in an immobilizing way when we're caught in this temporal double bind. And I argued that the best way to try and address that temporal double bind was to understand its sources. And I identified that source through my reading of Debord's book, The Society of the Spectacle, where I suggested that his analysis of capitalism helps us think about the way that political and economic institutions are arranged to control our attention and to shape our experience of time, to make it feel like this temporal double bind is inescapable. Right? And that's because there's all these ways in which temporality under capitalism is experienced as inevitable and objective, even though it's political, it's produced by our institutional arrangements. And if we recognize in that sense its contingency, we might be better oriented to finding possibilities for changing it. So I suggested in that second lecture that achieving climate justice is going to require a fight to control our own time so that it's possible to build the social relationships that we need. But how do we do that? How do we make space within this system? Especially when that system, it seems like, is not only dominating us, but it's also dominating nature. Right? We're living into this capitalist system that, as I've sort of drawn from some of the critical theory tradition to argue, right, it's a tradition that it's a system that began trying to dominate nature for our own benefit. It has now come to feel like it's out of our control. We can't stop it, even though it's no longer to our benefit. And so the Climate Vanguard report suggests that these climate youth groups talk about a system that puts profit over people and planet, but it suggests it's not sure how they turn that into a theory of change. So I think in order to do that, in order to think about how this can become a theory of change, we just want to put a little bit of more meat on the bones of what it means to identify a system this way. And so I want to go back to a thinker that I talked about in my first lecture, Raymond Williams, and his essay, Ideas of Nature. Because I think he suggests, it's very easy for us to talk about domination of nature, but I think one of the things that he importantly points out is there isn't really any one thing called nature, right? What we call nature is, in fact, as he puts it, a real multiplicity of things and living processes. And so often what we talk about as nature says more about who we are than says more about what nature is. It's often a projection of other elements of our circumstances. And so under capitalism, he thinks that that means we talk about nature in a particular kind of way. He says when nature is separated out from the activities of men, it even ceases to be nature in any full and effective sense. Men come to project on nature their own unacknowledged activities and consequences. Or nature is split into unrelated parts, coal-bearing from heather-bearing, downwind from upwind. The real split, perhaps, is in men themselves, men seeing themselves as producers and consumers. And so he suggests we need different ideas of nature because we need different relationships to nature. And so I want to look at some of the ways in which our relationship to nature has been shaped. In the previous lecture, I cited this passage from Marx's Capital, where he says, every advance made by capitalist agriculture is an advance not only in the art of stealing from workers, but also in the art of stealing from the soil. Capitalist production advances the technological means of social production processes, combines those processes more and more, only by damaging the very founts of all wealth, the earth and the worker. So I think there's two things that are notable about this argument, especially this argument being made 150 plus years ago. One is that even from the beginning of critical analyses of capitalism, it was identified that capitalism was exploiting our natural resources in an unsustainable way. And also that Marx, who's often thought of as someone who is thrilled by productive forces, or who's maybe held captive by a certain picture of the labor theory of value or something like that, identifies already the earth and labor as the sources of our wealth, right? The nature already is being seen as something of great value that we're destroying. Now, he doesn't think it has to be that way. We don't need to think about ourselves as being split from nature, dominating nature, putting ourselves over nature, right? In fact, he observes labor itself is a natural process, and humans are, of course, part of nature, although we often hold ourselves out otherwise. So he says labor is a process involving human beings and nature. In it, their own activity mediates, regulates, and controls their metabolizing of nature. When human beings work with materials found in nature, they are acting as natural forces. They set in motion the natural powers that belong to their bodies, arms and legs, head and hands, in order to appropriate natural materials in forms in which such materials serve human life. So there's nothing, as it were, wrong with using parts of nature and engaging in natural processes in order to further our own life. In a certain respect, nothing could be more natural. What's gone wrong, he says, is the creation of what John Foster Bellamy, an eco-Marxist, calls the creation of a metabolic rift in capitalism, so that our economic processes no longer are operating in the same cycles as the natural metabolisms of ecosystems, but are operating on, as it were, the tempo of capitalism, and so are extracting more and more resources in a way that can't be replenished, that are, as it were, disrupting our social and natural metabolism. So he says it's not the unity of living and active humanity which requires explanation, rather the separation between these conditions of human existence, a separation which is completely posited only in the relation of wage labor and capital. So we've created a world where we no longer see ourselves as a part of nature, we see our economic activity as separate from nature, and we see it as dominating nature. And as I talked about in the fourth lecture, part of what that means is that we're also then dominating ourselves. As part of nature, we have to suppress the nature in us in order to adjust ourselves to the rhythms of this economic system. So Horkheimer, in his lectures on the eclipse of reason, says, domination of nature involves domination of man. Each subject not only takes part in the subjugation of external nature, human and non-human, but in order to do so must subjugate nature in himself. Domination becomes internalized for domination's sake. So as we adjust ourselves to an economy that dominates these natural processes, that engages in extraction and creates this metabolic rift, in order to adjust ourselves to that kind of a system, we also have to dominate the nature in ourselves, right? The spontaneity that Horkheimer talks about. But it doesn't have to be that way. There are other ways of relating to nature, and I've tried to talk about some of them in the last few lectures. So Leanne Simpson, in her book As We Have Always Done, talks about a different way of existing in relationship to land, what she calls grounded normativity, or land as pedagogy, where there's a way of learning from the land and being in the specific part of land that you are in, rather than seeing all land as fungible, which is what's required in a kind of capitalist real estate market. I also drew on some of the thought of Robin Wall Kimmerer. Kimmerer says that we can think about nature as a kind of gift economy. Gifts of the earth or from each other establish a particular relationship, an obligation of sorts, to give, to receive, and to reciprocate. But under capitalism, capitalists see natural resources as a free gift of nature, right? Something that they can take and they don't need to give back. Kimmerer says in the gift economy, though, gifts are not free. The essence of the gift is that it creates a set of relationships, and the currency of a gift economy is at its root reciprocity. Now, I think this actually connects in an interesting way to the eco-Marxist analysis. Marx's word for metabolism, the German word is Stoffwechsel, which literally means a change of matter or a kind of material exchange. And so Marx's point about metabolism and the metabolic rift is very similar to Kimmerer's point about reciprocity. The point about a metabolic rift is that we're taking out more than we're putting in, right? And it's unsustainable for that to go on forever. So from all of these different kinds of directions, these different traditions of thought, we can find ways of trying to describe a different kind of relationship to nature that can better foster solidarity. Now, part of why I suggest it can better foster solidarity is because exploitation of nature is itself an obstacle to solidarity. The sort of capitalist system that creates that exploitation of nature also divides us in various ways. It divides us not just in the way that, of course, is the centerpiece of the Marxist thought, which is the division between workers and capitalists, but as he and Engels observe in the Communist Party manifesto, it also sets urban and rural people against each other. It sets countries against each other. And so let me just read this passage briefly. The bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It's created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, so has it made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones. Nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West. Now, I think we can read this passage in a couple ways. One is, let's say we'll read it dialectically. On the one hand, I think it's pretty clear Marx is not a big fan of rural life. On the other hand, I think he and Engels are observing that it creates serious obstacles to solidarity to set town and country against each other in this way. For workers in the country and workers in the city to see their interests as opposed and to not realize the interdependence that they have, right? And I think he's making a similar point about the quote-unquote barbarian countries. He's not saying the barbarian countries are actually dependent on the civilized ones. He's saying it appears that way from the perspective of the civilized ones. They think that they can, that the barbarian countries are dependent on them for guidance, when in fact, of course, it's the civilized countries that are dependent on the quote-unquote barbarian ones for all the resources that they're extracting through colonialism. So part of why we need to think about reorienting our view of nature is because the same system that is exploiting nature is also exploiting us and dividing us against ourselves. And I think it's particularly important to think about creating solidarity across these divides that are identified here, the urban-rural divide and also the national and global divides, because we need to cross those divides if we're actually going to address a planetary problem. So I think it's interesting, Marx and Engels, of course, writing this in 1848. It isn't, in fact, until 2007 that, globally speaking, the number of people in urban areas outnumbered people in rural ones. So in many parts of the world, the dynamic they're describing is still clearly relevant. I mean, in fact, even in the quote-unquote developed world, of course, there's going to be important urban-rural divides. And you can see, we can think about that on the national level and on the global level. The chart on the right shows how low-income countries still have a majority of their workers employed in the agricultural sector. So we need to think about this question: how do we create solidarity across these divides? How do we create a sense of shared interest that includes agricultural workers in the developed world, as well as urban workers around the world? And I think it's particularly important, as Holly Jean Buck observes in her book, Ending Fossil Fuels, because you can't put solar panels and wind turbines only in urban areas, right? You, in fact, we're not going to lose our dependence on rural areas in the move to renewable energy, right? Urban areas don't necessarily have this build-out capacity and will need to be sourcing renewables from rural areas. And so she says ending fossil fuels requires getting over metronormativity, right? The idea that living in the cities is normal. Who would ever want to enjoy the idiocy of rural life? The core periphery dynamic needs to be changed instead of reproduced with renewables. The political power to phase out the fossil fuel industry needs to include coalitions of people in rural areas. And I think you can see in many countries, in fact, the power of rural voters is a major obstacle to addressing climate in the way that those voters currently perceive their interests. This is, as you can see, urban-rural polarization just in Western democracies. Strikingly, actually, New Zealand is at the lower end of polarization between urban and rural, with the United States a big outlier as having the biggest polarization between urban and rural. But as you can see, in many of these cases, the polarization has been increasing, right, in these countries, not decreasing, which means to the extent that we need to create solidarity across urban-rural divides to address a climate crisis, we're making the problems getting worse, not better. And so we need to think through this seriously. Right? In the United States in particular, we've seen the political scientist Kathy Kramer talks about what she calls rural consciousness as being a sense of resentment of urban areas that then produces a lot of self-defeating politics. So the urban-rural divide is one form of, one way we need to create solidarity across the divides created by capitalism. But we also need to recognize the racial divides created by capitalism, that we live in a world of racial capitalism where labor markets are segmented by national, gender, and racial divisions. So those divisions are naturalized in various ways to make it seem like some people are naturally suited to cheaper labor, right? So the way in which it comes to seem common sense to many people in the developed world that, of course, women of color in Bangladesh can work in sweatshops. It's cheaper, maybe it's even good for them or something. And then that creates, that naturalization of those divides, right, creates opposition between workers in Bangladesh and workers in the US and elsewhere who feel like those people are taking their jobs or something like that. So capitalists are using those racial divides to undercut worker solidarity, to undercut wages. And I argued in the fourth lecture that we need to overcome, that the idea of a global subject can be a useful way of resisting that idea of national divisions, to resist the naturalization of those racial and national divisions, which will be necessary if we're going to identify shared interests. And I do think this is connected to the idea of exploiting nature, right? If you see nature as a resource to be exploited, you're going to tend to see your quote-unquote natural inferiors also as a resource to be exploited. Right? And so I talked in the second lecture about how progressive history, the idea that there's this kind of teleology of history, casts less developed people and indigenous groups as, in a certain sense, more natural and less civilized. And so for that reason, vulnerable to a kind of super exploitation. And one of the things that many theorists of this racial divide, like W.E.B. Du Bois in the early part of the 20th century analyzed, was how that form of superexploitation in colonialism, the surplus profits that were used from that, are then used by capitalists effectively to buy off the white working class in the developed world, right? To be able to pay them higher wages because they're paying even lower wages through the primitive accumulation of resources through colonialism. And so for that reason, there's this major obstacle to solidarity that develops as workers in the developed world become accustomed. One of the reasons why they can settle for lower wages is because they're getting cheaper goods out of colonized and formerly colonized countries. And so they will come to see their interests as opposed to see higher wages in the developing world as a threat to them. Right? But if we're going to address the climate crisis, then workers in the developed world and workers in the developing world are going to need to perceive and prioritize shared interests. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to overcome the obstacles dividing us to actually address this problem. Another obstacle that we need to think about is even what gets identified as work, right? I've talked in these ways about people working in sweatshops, but of course, a lot of the work that's done to keep humanity existing is the work of social reproduction that's entirely unwaged, right? The kinds of care work that gets often naturalized and feminized in many different ways in many different cultures. So that kind of reproductive labor is a necessary part of any kind of social metabolism. But again, that work is naturalized and rendered invisible. So again, if we're going to create solidarity among people with shared interests, that kind of work needs to be recognized as work, if nothing else, to create a shared form of identity among people, to perceive these shared interests. And as some ecofeminists have begun to argue, we should also be thinking about not just care work of humans, but care work of the earth as also unwaged work that needs to be compensated and recognized. So various ways of reproducing place-based knowledge are also important forms of social reproduction. And so recently, the political theorist David Temin has argued that he calls this earthwork, unrecognized and unpaid green jobs. And so he thinks that, again, as a way of fostering solidarity and recognizing this work, this is another reason why, to address the climate crisis, we need to respect and enable indigenous sovereignty and land tenure. So these are some of the divides that I think capitalism and neocolonialism have created that we're going to need to recognize and address to create the solidarity that's required to address the climate crisis. But in order to do that, we also need to think about the organizational form that solidarity is going to take. I think these ideas that I've suggested about how to identify are important, but solidarity, if I'm just acting on my own, is going to have its limits, right? Our actions need to be coordinated eventually in order to be meaningfully solidaristic. So I want to turn, as the last point to make in these lectures, to this question about what political and organizational form a collective agent should take today. And I think that's really urgent because I think we've seen some pretty spectacular failures of social movements over the past several decades. So the journalist Vincent Bevins, in his book, If We Burn, chronicles what's really been a spectacular explosion of social movements brought together, starting in many ways with the Arab Spring and moving forward throughout many countries around the world over the past 15 years. And he says these protest movements have been digitally coordinated, horizontally structured, apparently leaderless, and apparently spontaneous. Right? And so that's enabled some amazing things to come together, to happen in places that are often identified by location, because it's not a person that they're identified with, it's a place where people have come together, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or Tahrir Square in Egypt. And so, as he points out, communications technology makes possible the existence of big protests that come together very quickly. So quickly, perhaps, that no one knows each other, people are trying to realize contradictory goals, and after the initial energy fades, nothing remains. And so, in his perhaps overly negative, but I think critical and important to engage with account of these protests, he says these protests did a very good job of blowing holes in social structures and creating political vacuums. But in many cases, other groups who were better organized then filled that vacuum and occupied the space that they were able to take up. So think about the way that protests brought down the government in Egypt, only for the military to then take over. Right? And so as he points out, he criticizes the limits of these horizontally structured leaderless movements. He says that by rejecting or simply not engaging in the kinds of representative politics and organizing, they were unable to take advantage of these situations that they created. So they were able to show that the way things were didn't have to be, they were contingent, but that didn't mean that they were always going to get better. It also meant other actors could step in and make them worse. Now, the Brazilian social theorist Rodrigo Nunes says, right, so I think this might help us put the climate strike and some of the failures of those kinds of things in context. It's not only in climate that people are struggling with this question about the agent of social transformation. And so Nunes says, ours is the age of mass movements without mass organizations. And he's also critical of this idea about, as it were, them being, as it were, too flat. So he says contemporary social movements sometimes exhibit, quote, a hankering for indefinite inclusiveness that leads to endlessly deferring decisions because no decision-making space ever feels legitimate. The absolutization of horizontality by horizontalism, which is his word for the kind of making this horizontalism into a horizontality into a fetish, set standards that are literally impossible to live up to. Right? And so as we've had these sort of flat social movements that come together without leaders, he says part of that is we've been conceiving of leadership wrong. Right? If we think that leadership has to be concentrated leadership, if it has to be a kind of definite and fixed hierarchy, we're missing the point about what leadership is. He says the opposite of concentrated leadership is not the absence of leadership, but a condition in which the leadership function is open to being occupied by different agents at different times. The pack is not leaderless, but leaderful. We can call this distributed leadership. And I think this is very helpful for thinking about ways of reconfiguring social movements or reconceiving our participation in social movements. He says the minimal concept of leadership implied here supposes that to lead means nothing more than to be followed. Right? Leading doesn't mean commanding, doesn't mean ordering. It means, and it can be an invitation to follow me. Right? And if people follow, then you've led them. So he says we should think about leadership as being this function of orienting attention and action in certain directions, or as he puts it, initiating a process of diffusion. And if we think of leadership in that way, we won't be as resistant to the idea of leadership in social movements in the way that Bevins and he identify as a problem and one of the sources of the failures of social movements. Now, there's another word we might use for this kind of leadership, which is just organizing. Right? I think this is exactly the kind of work that lots of people use the word organizing to describe. So many scholars of social movements, and I'm drawing here from the Johns Hopkins political scientist Hari Han, distinguish between organizing and mobilizing. So another way of describing some of the problems with movements in recent years is there's been a lot of mobilizing and not very much organizing. Right? So mobilizing is just about trying to maximize participation by minimizing costs. Signing an online petition takes 2 seconds. Also, the people who get it know you've spent about 2 seconds thinking about it, right? Showing up to a rally and leaving, right? It's mobilizing. Organizing is about developing people's capacity to act on behalf of their interests. So it's actually, in that sense, another way we might describe it is leadership development, right? It's about getting people to become conscious of and to develop their skills. So there can be things like not just showing up to the rally, but asking other people to come with you, right? Helping prepare the signs, those kinds of things, going to the meetings. And now movements need both mobilizing and organizing. I don't, in this way of describing it, mean to minimize the importance of mobilization, because of course you also need that as well. But the work of organizing can be easy to neglect because it's resource intensive and often invisible. Now, there is a tradition of making organizing the center of things, right? And in fact, in the United States, in the middle of the 20th century, they developed this idea of organizing as a profession or a vocation, as I've said here, right? The idea, being an organizer is conceived as a profession with a skill set that's transferable to any issue and to any place, right? So it becomes a kind of technical set of skills that can be applied across areas. And it really comes out of the Industrial Areas Foundation, founded by the community organizer Saul Alinsky. And you can see here, this is a New York Times magazine profile of Alinsky from 1966. making trouble is Alinsky's business. And Alinsky says, we're just technicians trying to organize the people, right? So the idea is organizing isn't, in that sense, deeply connected to climate or anything like that. It's just a set of skills you can use really for anything, including for evil, let's say. And so in his critical history of community organizing, Clément Petitjean describes it as a sociologically trained social worker, come political agitator, come human relations management consultant. And if that seems like an overly sort of cynical description, I think if you look at the tools that community organizing has produced, you can see why that can feel apt. So this is a tool that I've used in my own organizing. It's actually super useful. It's developed by a group called the Midwest Academy, which started in the 1970s, coming out of the Alinsky tradition and combining it with the student movement. And you can see here, it's like a checklist, like a to-do list about how to develop a social movement, right? What are your goals? Here's the organizational considerations. What are your resources? How do you want the organization to be strengthened by the campaign? What internal problems do you face? Who are your constituents, your allies, your opponents, your targets? And then you can figure out your tactics, put them in a calendar. It's a very useful tool, but as you can see, it has nothing to do with any particular political cause. It's something that can be applied in lots of different kinds of ways. So there are pluses and minuses to this way of proceeding. Some of the downsides of it, right, or this idea of having community organizing or being an organizer as a profession tends to lead to conflicts between the professional organizers and unpaid members. Often the unpaid members of the community organization will feel that the paid organizer has an outsized voice in decision-making, often in decision-making that will take place behind the scenes. Alternatively, organizers can easily get burnt out and feel like members aren't recognizing how much work they're doing. Because it conceives of its own tools in this kind of apolitical and neutral way, as a kind of technician does, it can be very hard, it can be easy for these community organizations to address parochial issues. It can be hard for them to address systemic problems. And that's partly because they're trying to meet members where they are. Many of these groups also, actually, you're not allowed even to join as an individual. You can only join as an organization, like a church or some other pre-existing community organization. And as we've seen civil society in the United States and other countries get hollowed out, it's become harder and harder to find viable organizations to become member organizations for these groups. And importantly, under conditions of economic inequality, it can be very easy for these groups to become more accountable to their funders than they are to their members. So I think there's real limits to this kind of a model. Another organizational form that, of course, needs to be addressed is the mass electoral parties. And the question of what role will they play in thinking about a kind of collective agent of social transformation. For many people, it's just obvious that electoral political parties, mass parties, are at the heart of any program of social transformation. So in their sort of runaway bestseller, How Democracies Die, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt say, although mass responses to extremist appeals matter, what matters more is whether political elites and especially parties serve as filters. Put simply, political parties are democracy's gatekeepers. And in their political theory defense of political parties, Russell Muirhead and Nancy Rosenblum say, in contrast to single-issue advocacy groups, political parties address the public good in the widest sense. And so they say that if parties cannot link the groups vying for power in the legislature with groups in the larger society, then legislatures, which are the heart of representative government, lose their connection to popular interests, wants, and passions, and representative government loses something of its legitimacy. Unfortunately, I think for many of us that's happened. And so Peter Mayer, in his 2013 book, Ruling the Void, this is how he starts the book. The age of party democracy has passed. Although the parties themselves remain, they have become so disconnected from the wider society and pursue a form of competition that is so lacking in meaning that they no longer seem capable of sustaining democracy in its present form. And Mayer argues that there's two main causes of this. One is political parties are losing out to this rise of individualization that affects many different kinds of groups in civil society, the sort of bowling alone phenomenon, as Robert Putnam puts it. And also in effect, neoliberalism, right? Growing economic constraints on political action meant that political parties were making fewer and fewer consequential decisions as economic decisions were largely being made elsewhere. So I think Mayer's story is in many ways consistent with the story I've told in these lectures, and consistent in particular with Debord's sort of analysis of politics devolving into a spectacle. Empirically, you can certainly see the decline of parties in many ways. That's the chart of political party membership in New Zealand, which you can see has gone down consistently well, not quite consistently, has gone down quite a lot over the recent decades, even more dramatically than voting turnout has affected. In the United States, you can see here, basically in the past 20 years, no party identification or calling yourself an independent has dramatically exceeded people identifying as a member of any of the political parties. And you can also see this chart of global voter turnout by region, where political participation through voting has declined pretty much globally over the past 25, 30 years. If parties aren't the place, you might think, what about labor unions as agents of social transformation? Of course, neoliberalism has done a number on them as well. You can see here the chart of labor union membership down dramatically, pretty much everywhere from its peaks in 1980. So with the loss of not the obviously total loss, but with the weakening of all of these organizations, we've entered an era that Anton Jaeger, who's a lecturer in politics at Oxford, calls the hyperpolitics era, right? This is an era, he says, where everything is political and fervently so, right? So it feels like everything's politics. Politics feels like it's inescapable. And yet engagement with politics feels meaningless, right? Despite these wild passions overtaking and remaking some of the West's most powerful institutions, very few people are involved in the kind of organized conflict of interests that we might once have described as politics in its classical 20th century sense. We have a politics with only weak policy influence or institutional ties. The result is a preponderance of social media wars of movement over institution building wars of position. So people think and talk about politics all the time, post about it constantly, but it doesn't seem like it's actually connecting to the levers of power in the same way that you would want organized politics to. So in that kind of a context, it's probably unsurprising to see some people calling for something different. And so the political theorists Kai Heron and Jody Dean advocate for a revolutionary party as an important part of addressing the climate crisis. They say, if we're really on the verge of catastrophe, shouldn't we be building a revolutionary party able to respond to the disaster and push forward an egalitarian alternative? So they say the cause of the left's incoherence is its rejection of centralized top-down power. Right? Our problem today is not excessive centralization. After 40 years of neoliberalism, it's disorganization and unaccountability. So they say we need to see this moment from the perspective of the revolutionary party that we must build as climate Leninists. Right? So they call for, in that sense, the return of a kind of vanguard party. Now, Dean elaborates on her argument for this in her book, Crowds and Parties, and I can't really do the argument full justice here, but I just want to briefly touch on a couple points about it. Because basically she makes 2 points about why we need a party like this. One actually echoes the argument from Muirhead and Rosenblum that we need a party in order to have a certain kind of coherent we. So the way she puts it is the party is a form of organized political association that holds open the space from which the crowd can see itself and be seen as the people. So she thinks we need an organized party to make that possible. Otherwise, we're just going to be, as she puts it, a crowd. And that experience of the crowd is important. And she says, in the crowd, we're all equal, and it's the Communist Party that's the party faithful to what she calls the crowd's egalitarian discharge. So you need it to be a communist party in order to reproduce equality, the equality that you experience in the real political action of being a crowd in the streets. So that's the 2 components, really, of the argument for having a revolutionary party. Now, I just want to raise 3 problems or 3 limits of this kind of approach. One is that she more or less explicitly endorses what I've already called this representational logic of homogeneity. So like Ernesto Laclau, whose work I criticized in a previous lecture, she also draws from Lacan, the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, to argue for and embrace a kind of Hobbesian logic. So this is not like a a graphic I pasted up. This is a graphic from her article. So she's avowing this connection. Right, and she says that what we need is a kind of equalizing sameness to disrupt capitalism. And I think I've made it clear in some of these other lectures why I think equalizing sameness is not the right way to approach trying to understand a collective agent. The other problem is that the argument really remains at the level of affect. So she talks about what the party does for this dynamics of feeling, how it creates an affective infrastructure, but it's not really clear how those feelings relate to the party as an actual organization. And it's not really clear whether the party is actually the only form of organization that can generate these feelings for that reason. And finally, I think she poses a false choice between centralized top-down power and horizontalism. Right? She says either we have centralized top-down power or we have anarchy. The central point that follows from the unavoidable gap between few and many is that the charges of centralism and authoritarianism leveled at the Communist Party from its inception, in fact, apply to politics as such. If we are to engage politically, we cannot avoid the effects and affects of number. But, pardon me, I think this ignores a range of possibilities, right? There's a lot of space between Hobbes and Bakunin, including the possibilities of distributed leadership and reciprocity that Nunes argued, and that I highlighted earlier. So I want to go back to Nunes, just to begin to wrap up. So I think one of the things that he gives us as we think about the pros and cons of all these different organizational forms that exist, he argues that we should shift from thinking organization in terms of individual orientations to conceiving it ecologically, as a distributed ecology of relations traversing and bringing together different forms of action, disparate organizational forms, the individuals that compose or collaborate with them, and unaffiliated individuals who attend protests, share material online, or even just sympathetically follow developments on the news. So because we have these different forms, it's very clear that none of the forms we currently have are sufficient or the answer. So if we adopt this ecological approach, perhaps we can think about the different ways these kinds of organizational forms fit together, and the ways in which they can become, pardon me, more than the sum of their parts. So if we adopt that ecological approach, if we think, well, there's no one right way to address this, if we're all trying to figure out our different ways of contributing to the creation of a collective subject that can accomplish social transformation and address the climate crisis, if we shift our thinking in that way, he says, there are some lessons that follow from that, right? If there is a normative dimension here, it entails privileging cooperation over competition, nurturing common resources and mutually beneficial relations, and strategizing with a broad field of other agents in mind. And I do think that those are sort of helpful guidelines as we think about the ways for the different parts of the climate movement to interact with each other. So what's the path to solidarity? I think I've tried to collect here some of the arguments that I've made in the course of these lectures. I've argued that the problem isn't going to solve itself, right? It's not going to work. Like, unfortunately, I don't think market-based solutions are sufficient. And I'm simply pointing out to people that the problem is really important and we understand how it works has not translated into any sufficiently meaningful policy. And we need to understand why that is. And I think it's partly because climate change is deeply related to global capitalism, right? In a capitalist system, nature can only be treated unsustainably as a resource to be exploited because of systemic imperatives. If you don't do it, somebody else will. You might as well do it. But also, right, in this system, it's going to be very hard to end fossil fuels because that means stranding assets and losing profits. And that's, again, contrary to the system imperatives that are moving actors. It's also, we need to name and understand the relationship between global capitalism and climate change because the domination of workers makes it harder for us to resist. It makes it harder for us to engage in the project of social transformation. It's not just that we're dominated in various obvious ways, but affectively, right, we feel like spectators to politics, and we feel like we don't have time to get involved. So to change that, we need to understand ourselves as part of a global collective effort that's trying to transform social relations. And that agent, or the we that we're going to constitute and be a part of, needs to be non-dominating, and it needs to recognize a representational logic of difference. So building solidarity among the people who are going to make up that we, right, requires identifying a shared interest and organizing ourselves to overcome the obstacles to it, which doesn't mean we all need to be in the same organization, but we do need to recognize that we're all in the same ecosystem in every sense. So specifically, I want to go back in closing to this argument I made about the fight for time in the second lecture, right? I put forward Paul Apostolidis' work, of his framework of the fight for time, as something that facilitates solidarity who experience work in very different ways, right? People are precarious in different ways, some more intensely than others, but we can all identify that as a problem that we want to address. As he puts it, building a radically alternative, decapitalized society requires waging a fight for time against the temporalizing dynamics of precarity. So practically speaking, I think one part of what this means is building organizations that don't just take time, but that also help people make time for politics. So this is something that the right has been very good at doing. The right has built organizations that aren't always explicitly political, but that people are happy to make time for because they provide services and they provide non-political engagement as a way of building relationships that can then be turned to political ends. So in the US context, the National Rifle Association was for a long time an extremely powerful lobbying group, but where it got its power from was because it was also a kind of community organization. It provided services to people. Something like 1 million people a year got firearms training from it. And so the first way that they experienced the organization wasn't as a lobbying group, it was as a service provider, as like a community. If you wanted to deepen your involvement in the group, it didn't have to even be directly political at first, right? You could become like a firearms training instructor. And so part of why it became a very politically powerful lobby with something like 5 million dues-paying members is because people did not think it was only about politics. Right? They didn't join it because they cared about gun control in the first case. They joined it because they were shooting with their friends, and then they got politicized through that. You can see something similar, again, in the US context with multi-level marketing, actually. Groups like Amway and others have also created networks that people have found value in that have then become politicized. And of course, churches and so forth, mega churches, also provide ostensibly non-political services and experiences and community building in ways that can then build relationships of trust that then get politicized. So as we think about climate, we also need to think about something similar. How do we build organizations that people will make time for and that help people make time? Rihanna Gunn Wright, who's the climate policy director at the Roosevelt Institute in the US, had an interview the other day. I think it's got a very good quote about this. She says, "One problem the climate movement has is that it's led by a lot of people who are most motivated by climate." Right? Now that might sound a little bit obvious to you, but what she means is that, right, for a lot of people, climate's in the background. The way that they understand climate is very material: air, water, soil, food. Right? So presenting things as, in the first place, a climate issue is already to frame things to connect with people who, as she puts it, it's a foreground problem for. But she says self-interest is real. It's what motivates people. And so we need to think about, and she says, in the absence of being able to change their material conditions, they'll opt for feeling heard or feeling good, even if it goes against their material self-interest. So I want to put forward as an example of something that looks like a fight for time, some of the work that this group, People United for Sustainable Housing in Buffalo, New York, do, where they bring together green environmental issues and affordable housing. As they put it, homes that are not green end up costing homeowners and renters more in gas and energy bills. In Buffalo, which is very cold, a poorly insulated home can rack up a restrictively expensive heating bill during the winter, and many residents of these homes have had their gas cut off because they cannot afford to pay their bills. So there's a very direct self-interested reason to be reducing these costs for people who are experiencing them, and reducing those costs can also be a way of reducing their emissions and their climate impact. So one of the campaigns that Push Buffalo is running now is called Out of Gas, In with Justice, which is helping to remove natural gas stoves from people's homes and replace them with induction stoves. right? And that's something that is useful to them because it reduces their heating costs, and it's useful to climate because it reduces our dependence on natural gas. And through the work of this membership-based organization, right, that's a way to get an entry into this organization, to build relationships of trust that can then be politicized as people learn why it's not only important, why it's not only good for them to reduce their heating bill, but it's also good for them to be a part of this movement that reduces our reliance on fossil fuels. Now, you may not find that that hopeful. You may find that a small-scale example that might be hard to scale up to the scale we need, to which I go back to the way I ended the first lecture, which is that despair does not have to be an obstacle to solidarity. I think we can motivate people to engage in the climate movement, not just by assuring them that what we do will work, because we don't know if it will work, but because there is a present-day value to engaging in the work of the climate movement. It's an important way that even if you're not sure if what you're doing is going to work, you can still build community. You can still learn the skills of being politically active. You can still enjoy the pleasures of acting in concert with people that you care about. You can still express your values in a way that's meaningful to you. And none of those require us to be sure that what we're doing is going to work. Because as Dewey points out, we don't know if what we're doing is going to work. In Liberalism and Social Action, he says the question, his question at least, cannot be answered by argument. Experimental method means experiment, and the question can be answered only by trying, by organized effort. So I don't take it that what Dewey means is that arguments are useless, and I hope that the arguments I've offered in these lectures have had some value in orienting us towards solutions and helping us evaluate if our experiments are working. But I do take it that part of what Dewey is saying is whatever else we do, we have to try. We have to experiment. And I think that hopefully I've given some ways of thinking about what experiments we can and should conduct in the future to try to address this global problem. So I will leave it there for now, or at least I'll leave the lecture there for now. It doesn't need to be the end of our conversation. If you want to continue the conversation, please feel free to email me. You can also find me on social media, even though it's part of the Society of the Spectacle. And if you are interested in reading more about this, there's the references for the lectures at that website. But thank you all again for coming to all these lectures, and I do look forward to continuing the conversation.
Oh my gosh, so many questions. But I think there must be some in the audience.
Thanks. Really great lecture. Really enjoyed it. I was just wondering, to what extent would the green parties that exist around the world meet your specifications?
Well, again, I think part of the point is that we need to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of all these different organizational forms, because there isn't one organizational form that's going to work. And I think something like a Green Party is a good example because it's going to depend for its viability hugely on the national context and even on the kind of electoral system. The Green Party in the United States, because of the structure of US political institutions, right, is very limited in a lot of ways in what it can do compared to what a Green Party in a parliamentary system can do, for example. So I think it's very hard to, in that sense, give a kind of global answer. I haven't tried to say electoral parties are useless, but I have tried to say that we need to recognize the things that have weakened political parties. And I think in order for them to be really successful, they probably do need to be connected in a deeper way to some of the other organizational forms that we've talked about, like the social movement forms and others.
There you go.
Talofa Leota here, Pacifica. And of course, one of the strong indigenous communities that are directly facing climate change. I don't know about you, but every time I hear climate change, I roll my eyes. So I I give it to all of you that you turn up for talks like this. And the reason why I roll my eyes is, of course, you all know the story, sinking, melting ice and everything else. The thought that came to me was about culture. And culture is not necessarily about ethnicity. It's about the process of actually believing in something. And for that, it's about actually understanding what it is that makes me want to actually, even for someone who's sinking, wants to actually give a damn, because no one else seems to give a damn, or those who do, our hearts reach out, but I'm still sinking. So I think, and just thinking in terms of those who rely on the resources that we, that are making the planet weaker. I think about those ones who have the resources to actually create better economical shopping bags that you can put your food into, not the ones you carry around from Countdown and Pack and Save, okay? But some of those practicalities. And, we've had all the lectures and we've had all the talks about inviting our Pacific and our Indigenous people to a lot of conferences. But guess what, folks? They don't actually pick up our talks. Have you seen it? Have you heard it? And if you haven't, and if you cannot answer that question, then share with us in asking why. Where is it? Because most times we get shoved up to UN, and then that's where it ends, up in the UN. Oh my gosh, right now I've got words that are not nice for you and N. Okay, thank you, that's enough. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important comment, because I think one of the things it suggests is, I think, how many climate groups, even when they're trying to be open-minded, are often even implicitly operating on a kind of homogenous logic of representation. They expect, and I think this goes to gun rights' point in the end, they expect climate work to be someone who looks like them and who talks about climate in the way that they talk about climate. And I think part of really understanding the ecosystem of these movements and trying to really understand the scope of a global movement to address this problem requires recognizing deeper forms of difference, and not just recognizing them, but also saying it's not just a matter of like having groups on the outside integrate into what calls itself a climate movement, but the climate movement recognize the so-called, the self-identified climate movement, recognizing a lot of other work that's being done as climate work, and not just recognizing it, but seeing it as a form of leadership, right, that could then change the way that they're doing things, because clearly the way the self-identified climate movement is doing things hasn't worked.
Just going to very quickly follow up on that amazing question, because I was thinking about this too, especially about the UN, and I kept thinking in terms of my own environmental activism, the agenda has always been set by the United Nations processes. And I was wondering if there are lessons we should take away from this series of lectures about how wise that is to devote our time to an agenda that's set by the United Nations process, which has been so overall unsuccessful at changing people's actual day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the way of thinking about it as someone who was involved in the kind of global justice movement in the 1990s and early part of the 2000s was to think that was a movement that got cut short by the terrorist attacks of September 11th and the need for then people to mobilize against the US invasion of Iraq. And so a lot of the work that had been doing there, I think did in a lot of ways set the agenda and set the tactics for a lot of the climate movement later on. And one of the things that I think you really saw happening was after the great success of the protests at the WTO summit in 1999, there became a real pattern of kind of summit hopping. And I think you see that a little bit with like the COP summits as well, that they become magnets of attention and energy in a way that it's not in a way, if we wanted to talk about, like, let's say, the metabolism of the movement, it's not clear that they return as much energy as people put into them. And I think that's a movement that something the global justice movement was learning about the limits of kind of letting international institutions set the agenda. But that learning didn't get fully taken up because of the way that the movement got cut short. So I do think it's something that increasingly the climate movement is feeling now, just because it's so ludicrous to have these gatherings in, like, oil-producing states. I mean, it just shows the limits of anything that could be expected from those kinds of institutions.
Sorry to just huge jump, but that was just too important.
Thank you. One problem, it seems to me, with effective action about climate change. Now, I'm in favor of it, doing it mainly through political parties, which can affect massive social change if they're lucky and, the wind's in their sails and circumstances are right. But I think that's the right way to do it. But there's a problem both with that approach and with many of the other ones, that effective action on climate change is going to, in the short term, massively reduce the economic well-being of lots of people. Those actively involved in fossil fuel exploitation, but of course those who are involved in it at one remove, like people whose pensions are invested in this. So we drive the fossil fuel companies into the ground, good idea, I'm in favor of it, but what about all those people whose pensions are invested in it, not to mention all the people who actually work for it. So, and then the knock-on effects. So you produce something like a global depression, and that means there's less demand for many other kinds of services. So, there's a lot of short-term pain for, as it were, environmental gain, and mobilizing people for that is going to be a real problem. Now, I think you might be able to do it, but only in the context of a society which accepts sacrifice, but also distributes the sacrifice so it's not all on poor, but it goes to the rich too. Okay, so what's your response? Given that any serious action involves massive pain for the gain, how are you going to fix that problem?
Well, I don't think I'm going to fix it. But, well, I mean, I think one thing that's important to recognize is that there's pain the other way, too. I mean, I think that it's not as though there's this pain-free future that we could find. And I do think that, there's ways, of course, as you put it, of distributing the pain that make it more tolerable. And I do think that people are willing to, again, it's a question of how people identify their interests. And I do think, of course, given the system that we're under, people identify their interests. People are trained, habituated to identify their interests with how their stock is doing or what have you. And so, yes, from that perspective, it will look like a lot of pain. And there's very good reasons for identifying their interests that way. Of course, there's real material things that are at stake there. But that's not the only way that people can identify even their material interests, right? People also have a material interest in living in a part of the world that's inhabitable. And in many places, that's going to very soon be impossible. So I think you're right that there are time horizon questions. Sometimes the pain will be a little bit further off if we don't do anything than it would be if we tried to do something. And it is very hard to get people to accept those things. But I do think that one of the things that's really striking about the rise of the radical right is that I think you're seeing some people are willing to make sacrifices economically in order to live in a society where they can dominate other people. Some people are willing to be poor if it means that somebody else is poorer. And so I think we can overestimate how attached people are in that respect to material comforts because there are other forms of compensation, sometimes that move them even more. Now, we can't offer them that. We can't offer them the pleasures of domination, right? In fact, that's something we have to reject. But we do have to offer them other pleasures. And I do think that there are other pleasures to be had. But part of the problem is that they're often going to be different kinds of pleasures than the pleasures of cheap consumer goods that are readily accessible to us now. And so it does require it requires a discourse of pleasure, for sure, but it does also require people to use their imagination. And I do think that things like the Society of the Spectacle do weaken people's powers of imagination. You see that too with, I think, ChatGPT, the reliance on AI. It's like part of it is you have to get people to really think, and that's hard.
Last very short question. Oh, a short one.
Kia ora, Ben. Thanks so much for your deeply thoughtful lectures, including this last one. My question is actually about universities, with a really big acknowledgement to all the people in the room that I see and recognise who are doing the unpaid earthwork. We are privileged to be academics and to not just think about these things, but at least in New Zealand have a responsibility to act as well as critic and conscience of society. So as an academic, I want to hear what you are doing practically, especially in the context of the neoliberal university, and especially about resisting, this temporal resistance that you talk about.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways of answering that question. I guess maybe one thing I'll say is there's always going to be things that are close to home that one can do, and I do think that they can involve the transformation of the university. So a student group at Ohio State, the Ohio Youth for Climate Justice, is calling for the school to divest from fossil fuels. That can, of course, be a meaningful demand to make on any kind of large institution. In addition, Ohio State is such a large university, it operates its own power plant. And recently, a few years ago, it privatized that plant. And so I was part of a group working against the privatization of that, right, partly as a question of climate and democracy. Like, how are we ever going to be able to address the climate impact of it if it's under private control? So I'm in a particular situation now where the state has passed this law that prohibits the university from taking, quote unquote, taking any kind of stance on climate change, as though continuing to use fossil fuels isn't a stance on climate change. So, this is all recent political developments, and I'm not sure exactly what form the response is going to take. But I do think that we do have a responsibility to think about the institutions we are a part of, and often I think the most important forms of solidarity can begin by looking at the institutions that we do belong to. So I do encourage people to do that. Of course, universities are already in many respects kind of singled out as exceptional spaces, and so people try to contain the changes made there so they don't spread to other parts of society. So I do think that poses special kinds of challenges. But so I don't have one weird trick there either. But I do think that part of what it means is also connecting to people outside of university spaces and moving people who don't conceive of themselves as part of a climate movement, for sure.
Oh, thank you. Please join me in thanking Ben, and also join me in enjoying this food. In a few minutes, we can keep talking.